Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down that allows us to unpack some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I'm Dr. Lynn Robbins, co-host of Too Complicated for History, and I'm joined by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Thanks for being here with us today, Jim.
Lynn, thanks for having me again. It's great to be back with you.
Wonderful. Thanks for showing up after the first one. I thought it went well. Glad to see it did.
I had a good time, so let's do it again.
Yeah, so let's talk about episode 2. So in episode 1, we talked about the beginning of the First World War, right? The French and Indian War. And episode 2, it's titled The Nadir. And now the French and Indian War is underway. And so we're talking about it, the war getting started, but we're also talking about this idea of historical memory. So, which is absolutely fascinating, because what we're really asking is what is worth remembering? How do we decide what we're going to remember? Do we consciously decide? And so first, I was wondering if you could introduce us to the first clip that we're going to hear today, and then we can talk a little bit more about this historical memory.
I'd be delighted to, because we interviewed Dr. Christian Ayne Crouch from Bard College. And one of the things that she told us in our interview with her was the way that New France, the colony that the British had defeated in 1760 during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the way that New France, the memory of New France, factors in to French historical consciousness. And the answers may surprise you.
The sources that I looked at were primarily sources that were produced by elites, either in the colony or in continental Europe. And in part, that's just by virtue of volume of information and information that was considered worthy to be saved. And that framed the nature of this project. It would be a very different story if you were talking about militias or, individuals who were impoverished. And as a result, because I was also looking at war, I used many sources that were generated by men, but not exclusively. There are also women's writings, journals, diaries, letters that became increasingly important. I also was really interested in using visual sources in addition to textual sources, because these are individuals who live in an interdisciplinary world. That's not the word that they would have used, but you can't be a soldier without being able to read a map, which means you need to know how to draw. You need to be able to engage in description. You need to know how to dance. You need to read literature. You need to understand poetry. Culinary traditions and what you eat are as important as the things that you write.
So this clip was really interesting to me because I had talked to another individual. It was actually for an episode of Too Complicated for History. We talked to Mike Duncan, who had researched Lafayette. And he had gone to the French archives, and I believe he was in Paris, and he said he was researching Lafayette. And the people didn't seem to know much about what Lafayette had done. It wasn't, the big deal it was to us. So in America, you think Lafayette, oh my goodness, revolution, George Washington's son. But in France, they didn't seem to really even know much about him. They weren't impressed with him. And that's what this reminded me of. So let's talk about this concept of historical memory. So can you talk a little bit about what it is and why you think it's so important for groups, especially nations like we're talking about today?
Historical memory in its simplest form is how we remember the past, or how we selectively forget the past. And often how we remember the past conflicts with what actually happened. For a concrete example, in the United States, the most common historical memory that we might be familiar with is called the Lost Cause. It emanates from the aftermath of the American Civil War, and the Lost Cause essentially says that defeat was inevitable from the get-go. There's nothing the South could have done. The North had more men, money, and material, and so even though Southerners bravely fought in defense of their rights, the cause was lost from the moment the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. And what we see playing in Dr. Crouch's clip here is, or we're listening to Dr. Crouch in this clip here, is her experiences journeying into the archives and asking some of the same questions that Mike Duncan did in his journey on Lafayette, but saying, I want to study New France. Where are the sources? And the look of confusion she describes on the face of the archivists who were saying, well, you want to study colonies? Algeria, Indochina, Vietnam, places like that. 19th century, 20th century places. But New France is not there. And so what does that tell us about how the French remember their past? What does it tell us about how the history of New France informed how those memories developed? Because in some ways you can think about it, I guess in simple terms, who wants to remember that they lost an empire in North America? And who, even though a lot of the colonies that the French held in the 19th and 20th century are no longer under French control, there is a more discernible impact from those colonies on French everyday life, probably, or at least in the campaigns and the wars that they fought, than were the beaver wars of the 17th century in North America, or the fur trade, or the massive amounts of money that the French had to expend to maintain indigenous relationships. But most importantly, New France was lost to their historical rival, the British.
Right.
And in some ways it makes sense that that passes out of memory, that that's not something that's largely thought about.
Right. So before I delve deeper into that question, I'd like to know, can you just give our listeners a quick overview of what you mean by New France?
Yes. New France is the colony of the French in the 17th and 18th century in North America. And New France is separate from Louisiana, which is the southern colony under French control. But New France is roughly what we think today as Eastern Canada. And the French would have claimed what we call the Ohio Country, the territory south of the Great Lakes. And so if you think about it in sort of simpler terms, the area around the St. Lawrence River Valley and some of the Canadian Maritimes, but particularly in that space in the interior were the colony of New France, a place that was geographically expansive, but had a very small European population relative to British America by the mid-18th century.
Fantastic. So we're talking about this small area of New France and how, of course, as we heard from the clip, it's not really remembered today in France. From my perspective, it's not really talked about or remembered here in right. the U.S. either. And so your answer to the previous question sort of got me thinking, because you mentioned the lost cause. And a lot of the lost cause beliefs, myths were purposely created. They weren't necessarily accidentally forgotten, but it was actually created to sort of overcome the history as opposed to completely erase the history. So do you think that was the case with New France, or it was just more of, let's forget about it and think about our victories or think about better things that we've done and just put that aside?
Yeah, I really like the way you frame that. You're thinking about the old Confederacy as constructing narratives that explain what happened to them. And they essentially create false memories to justify their defeat. I do think it is the case. And I will say that I am not an expert on New France. Most of my knowledge comes from the research we did for the show, and particularly from Professor Crouch and Professor Fred Anderson on their work on the 7 Years' War era. But it does seem to be the case that there is a willingness to forget in France. Now, Quebec, it's different. As you heard in the clip, the license plate says, we never forget. Right. We don't forget. Right. And the memory of New France, the trauma of being incorporated into the British Empire in the mid-18th century has always stayed with Quebec. And, there's a reason why you see a secession movement pop up every once in a while. It's because French Canada has not really always felt like they are a part of what you might reasonably call British Canada, even still today.
Sure.
And I think the same is true in the United States. If you think about the American Revolution as simply a war of independence, then New France is not going to factor in your imagination.
True.
But I think as we talked about in episode 1 and as we're talking about here, New France is so important, and it was so important that we decided to dedicate large portions of the first 3 episodes to New France, on the basis of the really great interview we had with Dr. Crouch.
Yeah, she was absolutely fantastic. And I think it's so important to what you're doing, because I also believe that the French and Indian War is so important in understanding the American Revolution.
Right.
But I don't think we've really gotten to the point yet that we all accept that. And therefore, everyone is studying the French and Indian War to understand the revolution. So I'm very thankful that you're all dealing with that as well.
Well, and even it's funny, right? We all think we know the French and Indian War.
True.
And it has the two names that are really critical to this history, but it's almost like New France isn't there. And
that's true.
It fascinates me.
It's George Washington,
exactly.
who is the head of the British. He's the only one
right.
that matters.
Exactly.
And then it's the natives who are all clumped into one.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we win the land, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
exactly.
I think that's a really good overview of sort of historical memory and what we're talking about, and forgetting and constructing and, unconstructing the past and memories. And so, like I said last time on our episode 1, that I love stories. And that ties into historical memory. I love individuals. And one of the things that I think really excites historians, or maybe it doesn't, it's just me, we'll just pretend like it's all of them, or primary sources. So it's just, to me, there's nothing more exciting than when you're in the archives and you find something that either changes your perspective or you didn't know existed, or you find someone who, we might call as previously voiceless. All of a sudden, we find something related to them and feel like this person is finally getting a chance, finally getting a voice.
Yeah.
And so on the next clip, from the same interview, we're going to talk about Dr. Crouch's interaction and her discussion of her sources in the clip. Did you want to say anything before we play that?
Yeah, I think the only thing to think about, and as you hear her talk about, is the variety of sources that she used to construct this history. I think it's really important for people to understand that we're not simply dealing with just letters, but we are dealing with all kinds of material that allow us to unpack the past. And it really is detective work to put all of these things together to create a comprehensive portrait of what these worlds look like.
So when I started my research on this project and I went to the archives in Paris for the first time, and this is how green I was. I didn't even understand that I needed to go to the colonial archives that are in Aix-en-Provence. So I go to the archives in Paris and I explain I'm a graduate student and I'm working on French colonies. And they said, oh, great. Are you working on Indochine? Are you working on Vietnam? Are you working on Algeria? Are you working on Senegal? And I said, no. I'm working on New France. And I got this blank stare. And that was the first moment that I understood the incredibly thorough erasure of the memory of French North Atlantic Empire from a day-to-day French consciousness. I think it is much harder to step away from the legacy of violent extraction and racial capitalism in the French Caribbean, and also because there are millennia of relationships between the African continent and the European continent. So there is a way in which the Antilles could have a little bit more presence. But at that moment in time, in the early 2000s, if you said colony and France, the interpretation was that you were talking about the late 19th century through the 20th century. I think that has changed somewhat, but it is not something that one encounters readily in French culture. When I was in Toul doing research, there are no monuments to the French Marines and their families who were there. The documents are in the archives, but there's nothing marking their presence there. If you go to Marseille, there is a monument to the Harkis, who were the troops who served in Algeria. It's enormous. You can't miss it. If you go to Bordeaux, you can see references to the transatlantic slave trade, but there is no real depth of presence. And even when you start to think about 19th century relationships of indigenous peoples coming to the French continent, it's very much treated as though this has never happened before. There have been indigenous delegations going to continental France since the 16th century, but all of that had just completely disappeared. It was as if none of it had ever happened. And it is such a contrast to Quebec, where literally the license plate says, Je me souviens, I remember.
And things that I think a lot of us may not have thought of: food, literature.
Right.
We think,
Right.
oh, they're letters. It should be something directly written to someone from someone, and they say what's going on, and that's the truth.
Right.
But
for
all
sure.
of these different aspects, personally for myself, financial ledgers
Yeah.
have proved enormously helpful for women, for, studying women's history, but also enslaved people's
Yes.
history, because it's so rarely that we get to hear their voice. So again, it's all,
Absolutely.
interpretation. And so, as I'm saying, as I say, women and, minorities, enslaved people, these are the voices that I'd like to call the voiceless. They're the ones that we're constantly trying to sort of pull out of different types of sources.
Right.
And so the one person who's sort of focused on it in episode 2 is Charlotte Browne. And I was very excited learning about her because I hadn't learned about her before. So how in the world did you find her?
I found her in part because I was working with a primary source reader published by Dr. Timothy Shannon. It's simply called Documents Related to the 7 Years' War in North America. Published by Bedford St. Martin Press. They have a lovely line of these primary source readers that are excellent teaching tools. And in that compilation, he had an excerpt from the diary, the journal of Charlotte Browne, who was the matron of the military hospital in North America at the beginning of the war. I had never heard of Charlotte Browne.
No, me neither.
If I had read her in David Preston's work or Fred Anderson's work, unfortunately, I must have just just not noticed. But the excerpts in Dr. Shannon's book led me to her manuscript journal, which is digitized. You can go see it. It's fantastic. Digitized by the New York Historical Society. And I began reading. And the journal lasts from about 1755, from her journey with General Edward Braddock's army to North America, to about 1757, with the fall of Fort William Henry in northern New York. And she writes very short entries, but in those entries, you are getting a remarkable view of a person who is tasked with overseeing the nurses at this military hospital. But more importantly, I think, her everyday hopes and fears and tragedies. And you journey with her through these moments, through what becomes the darkest period of the war for the British in North America, when they think the French is drawing near, especially when she's stationed in Albany by 1756, 1757. And you get a remarkable portrait of someone who desperately needs more work done on her. Sarah Fatherly has written a very nice article published a few years ago, I think, in Early American Studies on hospitals in this period and the important role that women played in this process. But I think Charlotte Browne is extremely fascinating, and I would love to know more about her. Hopefully one of our listeners hears your call. Please do a project, do a dissertation, do a book on Charlotte Browne, because I think she's someone we should pay more attention to.
Absolutely. And the first thing I tend to ask myself when I come to a source is, who's the audience?
Right.
So usually if you're writing to an individual, you're probably not just spilling out your inner thoughts, that you're curating what you're saying.
Right.
And I think for the diary and the fact that she has shorter entries, I feel like you get perhaps a better insight into just her thoughts and what she deemed important enough to put down into writing.
Yeah.
And then from there, I think you could really jump off and take what she's writing about and then explore how that happened or what happened to really get a better idea of her life. So I'm echoing you in that somebody please pick this up and let's see some more work done on her.
Well, I'm curious, Lynn. I mean, you're an experienced documentary editor. You're a historian of women's history. How did you think about that source as you looked at it? What were some of the things going through your mind as you had both of those hats going on your head at the same time?
Well, I have to say there's so much more in there than I think a non-historian would see as they were reading through it. So two of the things that I read that I said, okay, I have to remember this because this is so much like other things that I've read, where she talks about when she's first arriving. She arrives to the colonies and she is introduced to someone and they tell her, well, you must not be a quality woman because you've traveled so far without a husband. And then someone else says, oh, well, you must be General Braddock's mistress. So sort of
Right.
this assumption, and right there you have this meaty information of the people saying that to her, but
Right.
also her personally, how she is taking that, but then also how this impacts the perception of women at the time. I mean,
For sure.
clearly, in order to be a worthwhile woman, you have to travel with your husband, with a husband. So you have to
Right.
have a husband. You have to travel with your husband. And if you don't, well, then you must be a mistress of someone important.
Right.
And so that really, right along there, that made me think, okay, this is already something I want to delve deeper into. And
Yeah.
it kind of reminded me of the financial ledgers,
Mm-hmm.
where you just have these tiny little snippets of information. But once you start pulling out aspects of it and then researching deeper into those aspects, that can lead you somewhere else. That can lead you somewhere else.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of the Martha Ballard
Yeah.
diary,
Yes.
that
Yes.
if you just look at it, you think, okay, she's saying I stayed here for a day. I crossed a bridge. You're like, okay, but there's an award-winning book written just from that diary. And I think this
Right.
is something else where
I
that
think
could
that's
really
true.
be done. And I think it could be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and to your point about how you can take the entries and then begin to, let's call it, explode them and sort
Yeah.
of see the larger world. I mean, one of the things that I was so fascinated by was in her diary, these reports that essentially reports tracking fear. Like,
Yes.
they think the French are coming to Albany. Things are so bad in 56 and 57 that they think that any moment the French are coming. And the window you get into their psychology at that moment through her diary, what that must have been like. And, at these places, it's not just people in the army and women like Browne who are serving in that army, essentially. There are families there. There are women and children
Right.
there. There's a whole community who was probably experiencing similar fears because there's information and misinformation that's circulating throughout the area, and you see some of that in her diary. And in some ways, it's kind of terrifying to read. You can kind of put yourself in the mindset of the people who are experiencing that.
Right. And it almost, it's a way to understand something that didn't happen, because
Right.
you think,
Yeah.
okay, well, the French didn't attack. Let's move on. But
Right.
for the people who were awaiting this attack, it was an event. It was a very
Yeah.
important event, something that impacted them and stayed with them.
For sure.
And of course, we're also, if you want to talk a little bit about how she was the matron of the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
I think that, women's roles in survival of armies
Yeah.
are vastly underplayed. So,
Vastly underplayed.
yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's a kind of a preview for episode 3 of Worlds, in which we talk a little bit more about the important role that women played in the army. 18th century armies do not function without women. Their survival, their maintenance, their ability to march, their ability to keep themselves clean, to feed themselves, are largely dependent on women, women's contributions, and also children as well. But women are there performing all kinds of domestic labors, all kind of sexual labor, making contributions in ways that are seen and unseen. Scholars like Holly Mayer and Lauren Duvall and Zarina Zabin have been writing a great deal, and Mary Beth Norton, of course, is the dean of all such studies, is unpacking a world that I think oftentimes gets lost in generals, in climactic battles, gets lost in sort of these decisive moments, when really we should be looking in many real respects, and we're going to continue to do this over the course of the series, and especially as we get to the revolution, is how are women enabling these armies to survive? But more importantly, how are they taking advantage of the opportunities afforded to them to make their own decisions, to bolster their economic vitality, to form real relationships or even temporary ones? And I think a lot of the scholarship that's coming out as a consequence of the run-up to the anniversary of the 250th is helping us to understand better the central role that women are playing to keep army lives in the 18th century.
Right. And I think it's very easy for us to look at soldiers and officers and say, well, they're risking their lives. Look what they're giving up. But it wasn't an easy or safe undertaking for the women either.
No.
Charlotte was from England, correct? And she had to travel. And then
Right,
she left
right.
her family back home, right? So
Yeah.
she was giving a lot up.
And to your point about, the comments that she was sailing without a husband,
Yeah.
she was a widower. Her husband was dead. And, risking an Atlantic voyage is a very serious threat. You
Yes.
could get caught in a storm, other things could happen, certainly. But then one of the things we try to make clear in episode 2 and then upcoming in episode 3 is that women are sharing the risks of this endeavor. And in episode 2, we talk about the fact that there are 50 women with General Braddock on the march to Fort Duquesne, and almost all of them are killed or taken captive by native peoples.
Right.
And so they are marching with these armies, and they are bearing the risks associated with military campaigns.
Right. And it seems like for Charlotte, as the matron of the hospital, she does achieve some power.
Right.
Because isn't she, she's sort of managing all of the other volunteer nurses?
She's in charge of the nurses. Yeah. Her title was matron of the military hospital. So she had oversight of the nurses, and so she is, doing the essential task of essentially assigning duties, things like that, of overseeing the sick. And as things progressively get worse for the British, particularly in the northern borderlands of New York in 1756, 1757, there are enormous casualties
Right.
that are occurring. People are coming back, and people have to be cared for. And of course, it's the 18th century. There's no antibiotics. And so people are going to get sick.
Right.
And especially when you crowd people together in a place, that is just a pool for disease to erupt.
Right. And I think anyone who's known someone, in the military, in the battle, certainly it's very important duty to be the
Right.
person caring for
Right.
an injured soldier. And
For
also
sure.
we have to imagine that impacted the psyches
Yeah.
of the nurses as well.
Right.
I mean,
right.
just as much battlefield trauma for the
Yeah.
women who have to deal with the injuries.
I think so. And one of the things that's made clear in her diaries is that she gets very lonely. I mean, there are instances where some of her friends leave Albany, and she writes, I think 1756, 1757, writes about that loneliness. It's a very short entry, but the fact that you make the point of writing that
Right.
down, that you feel isolated in a place that's not your home, on the front lines of a major imperial war, it's really quite moving, and there are lots of entries like that.
And it's definitely, we'll have to put the link to the transcription to her diary
Sure. Yes.
into the notes for this, because I think the listeners would really like to go
Yeah.
and be able to skim it and decide when they want to write a book on it.
Yeah.
But I'd like to sort of round up this episode 2 of our Revolutions Reconsidered, talking about sort of the end of Charlotte's story for our
Yeah.
purposes for episode
Right.
2. So the end of the episode's pretty brutal for Charlotte.
Right.
And I think the people who are listening and have, you tend to get a little attached to some of these individuals. And so, if you can explain that, but also I'm
Right.
interested in how was recording it and making this part of the episode, how did that impact you and maybe the voice actor?
Right.
So beyond the history,
Sure.
how does dealing with something like this really affect you?
It's a really terrific question. And as listeners will find when they listen to the episode, we use Charlotte and her diary to kind of act as a scaffolding for the episode. But as I was doing that, it dawned on me that I wasn't doing enough for her. We didn't really have, we were using her as a crutch, but not allowing her to be a person. And there were several moments we could have chosen, but the hardest one, and the one that I think really gives you a sense of what it was like for someone to make the commitment to go abroad, to serve, as she does, is when she receives news that her daughter Charlotte has passed away. And it's late 1756, I believe. And she writes a very short, again, but very moving passage reflecting on the death of her daughter. And, she said her daughter was in whom her soul was centered. And that's hard to read because she's already left her children. They're 3,000 miles away, and now one of them's gone.
Right.
And so very late in the process of this episode, I had already reached out to my friend, Dr. Grace Mallon at the University of Oxford. And I was like, Grace, she's a fellow podcaster. She has a lovely podcast on constitutionalism and federalism. And Grace, I was like, would you be willing to voice this role? And as she jokingly said, well, you just want me because I have an English accent. And it's like, well, yes. Because we are trying to give people a sense of the 18th century soundscape as best we can. And so I sent her the majority of the passages, but late in the process, I decided, I want this very dark moment in this episode. And so on the morning of the recording, I said, Grace, would you mind reading this passage? She didn't know what it said. And she read it on the first take. And that's what we hear in the episode. It was sort of very raw, very unprepared. You can kind of hear the emotion in her voice that I don't think she actually had to portray. Like the experience of reading that hardship was there. And then through the editing process, by pacing her a little bit and then adding in very sort of sorrowful music to heighten the emotional state. When I was editing that episode a few nights ago and getting it ready for release, it was hard. Like I was like, maybe I've gone too far because like this hurts, but but I think it was an opportunity to show Charlotte in a light beyond simply recording major events, that she had experienced loss just as much as any of these other people had.
Right.
And she is dealing with that as she has all these other people under her charge, as she's experiencing loneliness, as she's experiencing a bitterly cold winter in 1756, 1757. So I was glad we were able to do that, and I hope that people will do more with Charlotte's story in the future.
Well, I'm really, really glad that you kept that in. I thought it was absolutely beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's one of the wonderful things about doing history, and I think it's something that would not have been as easy to do in text in a book.
Sure, right.
And it's something where I think people can listen to it, and yes, it's so far away in a world that we feel like is so different from ours, but then we hear the specific words and the humanness, and all of a sudden it's not someone 300 years ago. It's something that you relate to, you understand, and it's about humanity. And so I'm very glad you included that, and I think it's one of the beautiful things about doing this podcast.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. And so I want to thank you for being here again for episode 2. It was so much fun.
Thank you.
Super excited for episode 3. It's like every episode, it's exciting to see where we're going to go, who we're going to meet. So yeah, we'll look forward to that. And hopefully our listeners, after listening to episode 3, will come on back and hang out with us for a little bit and hear some behind the scenes. So
that'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you, Lynn. See you next time. You've been listening to Revolutions Reconsidered with Dr. Lynn Price Robbins and Dr. Jim Ambuske. Revolutions is a co-production of Primary Source Media and R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Our producers are Patrick Long, Jeanette Patrick, Lynn Price Robbins, and Jim Ambuske. Join the revolution by heading to primarysourcemedia.com or find Primary Source Media on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.